We must not stop at bribery, deceit, and treachery when they should serve towards the attainment of our ends. Well, what about the youth today? What about drugs today? What about corruption of the morals of our youth? The CIA is the biggest drug dealer in America, has been for years, starting back in the 1960s, okay? Going on. By the way, speaking of drugs, let me just mention, there's a recent article in Reader's Digest. In fact, it was January 1996. And here's what it says. In 1993, some 6 tons of heroin, 200 tons of cocaine, and 3,900 tons of marijuana crossed the Mexican border into the United States. Now, this is just what's crossed the Mexican border. This doesn't count what came into Mena, Arkansas. The Mena, Arkansas drug operation was a $100 million a month operation for 10 years when Clinton was governor there. By the way, Larry Nichols, who was marketing director of the Arkansas Development Finance Authority, which was used as the device for laundering the drug money and for making the loans, told Bill Clinton, according to Larry Nichols, that we had this big drug operation going, and Clinton told him, hey, that's a federal problem. Well, now that he's president, I guess maybe it's a state problem. But for those of you who are not familiar with the Mena, Arkansas situation, the Arkansas Development Finance Authority was established in order to provide money, loans to schools, churches, and students. And instead, it was used to launder money from the Mena drug operation. And in that particular operation, they were flying arms out and drugs in. And Bill Clinton himself personally signed off on each loan. The loans were not repaid in many instances. In some instances, they didn't even make one payment. And Don Tyson, according to Clinton Chronicles, #2, himself took a $10 million loan from there and never paid it back. So we're talking about just the Mexican border here. We're not talking about what was flown in and out of this country. We're not talking about what's coming over from the Canadian border now. And my confidential sources tell me that there's extensive drug operations coming in from Canada. Now, stop and think about this. There's an extensive amount of corruption in the state of Nebraska. There's no question about it. My sources in Montana tell me that there's an extensive amount of drugs and corruption with officials in that state. It makes a lot of sense, and it's much easier to corrupt a state with a few small population rather than with a large population like New York and California. So I think that's what we're looking at, and that would also include, of course, Arkansas. Now, according to these statistics are estimates by the White House Office of the National Drug Control Policy. Now, bear in mind, there was 1993, 6 tons of heroin, 200 tons of cocaine, and 3,900 tons of marijuana. I've already said that once. Now, yet that year, Customs confiscated from trucks, tankers, and vans less than 9 tons of marijuana, 4 tons of cocaine, and no heroin. So we're talking about corruption? Yes. Corruption at the highest level. Now, I have some sources, some confidential sources who furnish me information from time to time. And there's code words for some of these various operations. The code word that I'm going to tell you about right now, and this is in my source's own handwriting. He doesn't write too well, so I may make some mistakes. The Black Rose is the code word for this. It's a clandestine group of U.S. government operatives, primarily the CIA, which has for many years run illegal drugs and arms operations in both Southeast Asia via the Golden Triangle and the Middle East via the Golden Crescent, funded by the British socialist-based Russell Trust drug cartel. The Black Rose's current chairman and co-founder is an individual known as the White Rose, or GHWB, a known bisexual pedophile and CFR, Council on Foreign Relations conspirator. This man, as a top member of the Skull and Bones Society, developed the heroin ring, which, while servicing as ambassador, along with his CIA activities. The Black Rose also runs cocaine through Panama from Colombia to the offshore oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. That's from directly from a government agent. Now, we mentioned Vietnam. In the McDonald case that I described to you earlier, the motive for the cover-up, and I waited until now to tell you about this. Helena Stokely told me that the reason for the cover-up was because her satanic cult drug group were bringing drugs in from the base that had been flown in plastic bags in the body cavities of the dead GIs from Vietnam in Air Force planes, CIA planes. They were bringing the drugs off the base and distributing them up and down the East Coast. And they went in on their own, wiped out the McDonald family, without the knowledge of the higher-ups in the drug operation, which included some top Army personnel, some police officers, 2 attorneys in Fayetteville. And the higher-ups were afraid that if there was an investigation of Helena Stokely's satanic cult group, it could expose the whole operation. You want documentation on drugs being flown in plastic bags in the body cavities of the dead GIs? Look at Time magazine, January 1, 1973. I mentioned Mena, Arkansas, drugs. By the way, there's been so much heat placed on Mena, Arkansas, that they've shifted their operation for this drug activity to Biloxi, Mississippi. I mentioned the laundering of money on the Mena, Arkansas case. They were laundering their money through the Arkansas Development Finance Authority into a BCCI bank in Atlanta, Georgia, and one in Florida. And they also laundered their money in Ross Stankowski's bank in Chicago. Beg your pardon? That's right. I'm sorry. That's right. We're not supposed to have questions, are we? Okay. Now let's talk about the next point here, item number 9. Turning to politics, he claimed that they had the right to seize property by any means and without hesitation, if by doing so they secured submission and sovereignty. He pronounced, our state marching along the path of peaceful conquest has the right to replace the horrors of war by less noticeable and more satisfactory sentences of death necessary to maintain the terror which tends to produce blind submission. I gave a speech just a few nights ago for the Prophecy Club in Wichita, 2 nights ago as a matter of fact, and a farmer came up afterwards, told me about his problem, and I'm sure that some of you here may have the same problem. He was granted some loans by the bank, and he was making his payments. He had a little problem for a short period of time, but he was able, he felt like he could catch up on it, and they recalled the whole note. Now he's in the process of losing his farm. It's been in the family for 5 generations. This is tragic, and this is happening to farmer after farmer after farmer. I don't know if those of you who are familiar with the Gordon Call case out of North Dakota, IRS came in. They were going to take his land away from him, his farm away from him. He had a shootout with the U.S. Marshals on the highway. His son, Yori, was shot and is presently serving life in the penitentiary right now. I'm glad to report that Yori's attorney is John DeCamp from Lincoln, Nebraska, who's also worked with the Nebraska Franklin cover-up case. John's a wonderful man and a great attorney, and I've been working with John, as I mentioned, since the late 1980s. But Gordon Call had to go into hiding in Arkansas, and he was ultimately murdered by the marshals. And the sheriff who went in with the marshals, according to information I have, made the statement after they shot him, oh, you shot the wrong man, and then the sheriff ended up dead. I can't say that somebody shot him or didn't shoot him, but I know he ended up dead. The house ended up being burned down. Those of you who are familiar with Dianne Feinstein, the senator from California, she's introduced a bill about taking the national parks and taking the state land and county land and turning it over to the federal government. There is an organization in the government itself known as the International Biosphere Reserves. The New World Order, this is again from one of my sources, for a section of land, the New World Order term for a section of land that has been turned over to the World Conservation Bank, that's the World WCB, in lieu of payments of the debt of the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. It's called the International Biosphere Reserves. In the U.S., largely unknown by most Americans, Many beautiful national parks and wilderness areas are quietly being turned over to the world bankers, the Rothschilds, Rockefeller cartel.